(2,700 years before the times of Christ), the Chinese Emperor Shenyang wrote of the attributes of a healing and intoxicating herb known as ma. Ma was traditionally cultivated for food and textiles, and is thought to be the world's oldest domesticated crop. Ma is incredibly nutritious. As a domesticated crop, ma becomes much desired throughout the rest of the world. In addition to clothing and food, it becomes primary source of oils, and makes the finest rope and sails. The word canvas is derived from the word cannabis. Around the world, different cultures celebrated its many virtues. Prepared in India, it's bang. In Egypt, it was important in the journey to the afterlife. From the beginnings of recorded time, ma played an essential role in the development of civilization. For nearly 10,000 years, a harvest of ma was something to celebrate. On December 5, 1933, the disastrous social experiment known as Prohibition ended by a repeal of the 18th Amendment.
Uh-oh! There'll be no more scenes such as this. Barrel after barrel of prize whiskeys destroyed by government agents. It's going to be a cold winter for the barrel busters.
Alcohol prohibition had failed. Law enforcers and those in the temperance movement alike rallied behind a new common cause and found a new common enemy. They found it in marijuana. Reefer, muggles, the weed of sin. This war against marijuana also became a war on culture and music. Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, Gene Krupa, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, and Ella Fitzgerald are all considered a viable and serious threat to the nation's moral fiber by this new legal and temperance movement. Movie theaters across the country, marijuana is hyped up to be the new public enemy #1. The message was that marijuana would cause children to lose their minds and become maniacal. There was no middle ground in their war on marijuana. People had now become expendable. The children they said they wanted to protect now replaced the bootleggers that federal agents used to hunt instead. The birth of a new legal and prison industry had begun. As arrests increased rapidly, many soon realized a new type of domestic war had been waged across the nation. But then a larger war overshadowed the marijuana war. And then another. And another. And then it got worse.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Richard Nixon was about to elevate the war on marijuana to new unimaginable highs. When Nixon crossed over into Cambodia from Vietnam, the public became increasingly uneasy by what they were seeing on their televisions nightly across the nation. Back home, the anti-war sentiment was growing ever larger.
Good evening. Marching behind flags and banners and picket signs demanding peace now, at least 200,000 anti-war protesters jammed the streets of Washington today. Despite the huge crowd, no Nixon administration official nor any of the Democratic presidential contenders spoke at the rally or appeared on the Capitol Hill platform.
Nixon reasoned that the anti-war protests were actually anti-Nixon protests. He needed to distract from troubles at home and abroad, and in marijuana he discovered a new tool to put a wedge between those who supported his war efforts and those who didn't.
I didn't want on marijuana, but just tears the ass off of them. That's the funny thing. Every one of the bastards that are out for the less marijuana is Jewish. What's the crisis matter with
Nixon had earlier created the Schaefer Commission to study and find the negative effects of marijuana. He did not get the response he was looking for. Nixon stood firm. He was going to start a war at home, in addition to the war overseas.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
A vast new agency was created with the power to circumvent expected constitutional protections for the average American. Eventually, Nixon left the office of presidency in shame. But the die had been cast. In 2 short years, the DEA was amongst the most powerful agencies in existence. The year Nixon resigned, the newly formed DEA became involved in its own scandal. 2 years later, with the troops home from war and a new president at the helm, there was a brief period of calm.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Incoming President Ronald Reagan would soon raise the stakes in the war against marijuana, and at even higher costs. The government started a systematic program of spraying Mexican marijuana crops with the herbicide paraquat. Even though the herbicide is toxic to humans, it is reasoned by the Reagan administration as less harmful than marijuana itself. As Reagan set out to convince the nation of the evils of marijuana, the times were about to change.
Public health officials say they've stepped up their battle against acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, and that finding a cure is their #1 priority.
Until cannabis prohibition, marijuana had been referenced in the U.S. pharmacopoeia and was a common prescribed medicine. Marijuana was known to be much more body-friendly than opiates and was far more safe, but the Reagan administration was determined that marijuana would not be made available to those who could most benefit from it. The DEA had recently given the okay for the expensive and mostly ineffective synthetic drug known as Marinol. Much like the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration found itself with foreign and domestic troubles of its own making, and much like Nixon, Reagan found himself a familiar distraction.
37 federal agencies are working together in a vigorous national effort, and by next year, our spending for drug law enforcement will have more than tripled from its 1981 levels. We have increased seizures of illegal drugs. Shortages of marijuana are now being reported. Last year alone, over 10,000 drug criminals were convicted, and nearly $250 million of their assets were seized by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration.
While Reagan invested in putting more people in prison than ever, his wife Nancy would join him on the crusade and would adamantly tell the nation it was all about morality.
There's no moral middle ground. Indifference is not an option. We want you to help us create an outspoken intolerance for drug use. For the sake of our children, I implore each of you to be unyielding and inflexible in your opposition to drugs.
For the rest of his term, Reagan was determined to keep his own troubles off the front pages and to keep the war on marijuana on the public's mind and the public's time.